Good afternoon and a virtual welcome to all of you to the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey. I am Maria Mercedes Tuya, and under the Computing Administration Department, I am responsible for the Digital Scholarship Initiative at the Institute for Advanced Study. During the academic year, we organize digital scholarship conversations, hoping to provide the community with knowledge of digital tools and projects of relevance to the different areas of scholarship covered by our four different schools. In today's presentation, The Book and the Silk Roads, Corralling Data in the Digital Workspace, we will have the opportunity to hear firsthand from Suzanne Akbari, Jessica Lockhart, Raquel de Cresce, and James Sargan about their shared experiences in making their project, The Book and the Silk Road, come to life. There will be time after the presentation to address questions and discussions. Please use the chat tool to submit them. Suzanne Akbari is a permanent faculty at the School for Historical Studies at IAS representing medieval studies after being for 24 years at the University of Toronto. She is co-PI for the Book and the Silk Roads project. If I were to describe the connection between digital scholarship and her work, I would say that it is the common goal of share. In her own words, it is her aim to look at the past through the lens of some very old works of literature and to encourage others to read these works too and to think about their shared histories, providing resources that might be helpful as we reflect on how the medieval past can help us to understand how we got to where we are today and to consider what kind of shared future we might want. Beyond her research work, which falls in the two areas, the philosophical and the scientific background to medieval literature and religious, ethnic, and racial borderlines in the Middle Ages. It is also her interest to build virtual community around the processes of reading and writing, editing open access volumes such as How We Write 13 Ways of Looking at a Blank Page and How We Read Tales, Fairy, Nothing, Sound, and also serving as co-editor for the Norton Anthology of Word Literature. I also encourage you to check her literature podcast, The Spouter Inn. Suzanne will be introducing the rest of the speakers as she goes through. And without further ado, Suzanne, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Maria, and thank you both for that extremely kind introduction, which I did not know was coming, and also for organizing us today and for all the work you do to facilitate digital scholarship here at IAS and abroad. Thank you so much. So, as Maria mentioned, I'm one of three co PIs on a research project called The Book and the Silk Roads, along with Alexandra Gillespie, Professor of English and Medieval Studies at the University of Toronto, and Sean Meikle, Associate Chief Librarian for Digital Strategies and Technology at the University of Toronto Libraries. The project is generously funded by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, and its driving force is Alex Gillespie, who's a specialist in codicology, that is, the study of the book. And in her spare time, Alex is also one of the University of Toronto's vice presidents and principal of the university's Mississauga campus. So, as you can imagine, the book in the Silk Roads is a deeply collaborative endeavor. In the next few minutes, I'm going to give a very brief overview of the project, its purpose, history, methodology, and structure, before turning things over to three project members who will go into more depth. Dr. James Sargan and Dr. Jessica Lockhart will offer some case studies, and digital librarian Rachel de Cresce will lay out some of the technical challenges and insights that we've encountered so far in the life of the project. The Book in the Silk Roads is a large scale project that seeks to tell the story of the book in a different way. We tend to hear a simple triumphalist narrative centered on Christian Europe that tells a teleological story running from the biblical codex of late antiquity to the early modern printing press of the Gutenberg Bible to today's digital age. By contrast, we are working with a wide network of collaborators to tell many stories of the book, centered on many different parts of the world. Some of the case studies you'll be hearing about today illustrate the transformative nature of our project in a way that my brief overview could never do. For those interested in medieval history and culture, though, I will just say that our project is a way of responding to and engaging in what is sometimes called the global turn. Many people talk about the need to be global, to be inclusive in the histories of the world that we relate. None of us, however, is able to do this work alone. It requires a network of researchers working in many different fields with specific language skills and knowledge of cultural and material history, working together to share research findings and methodologies. That's what the book in the Silk Roads is all about. The Silk Roads of our title refer both to the networks of trade and exchange that link the pre-modern world, connecting Europe and Asia, and also our own networked research community. Unlike the pre-modern Silk Road, however, our project takes materials not only from Europe and Asia, but also other parts of the world, including the Horn of Africa and Mesoamerica. And in the next phase, we're hoping to widen our scope even more. I've mentioned that our networked approach brings together scholars working on the history of the book within a wide range of cultural environments. Islamic manuscripts from North Africa, Kashmiri manuscripts from South Asia, Aztec codices from Mexico City, Chinese print materials from Dunhuang, and many more. Beyond this, the distinctive methodology of the book and the Silk Roads is to bring together humanistic researchers with digital librarians. We work together in an iterative way to develop our project methods with particular emphasis on data management capacity, interoperability, lightweight tool development, and user experience. Beyond this level of collaboration, we also work with engineers and computer scientists to open up what book history has to tell us, including micro CT scanning and other technologies, which you'll hear about shortly. Conservators are among our most important partners in this work because they too bring together field-specific research with technical expertise in the materiality of the book. Our particular focus in this project is book bindings. You might ask, why on earth would this be of interest? And there are at least 3 reasons. First of all, material culture. The materials that make up the binding, the leather, paper, cloth, thread, metal ornament, tell us something about the networks of trade and exchange that are instantiated in the book we hold in our hands today. Second, craft practice. The form of the book, the way the leather was cut and shaped, the warp and weft of the textile lining the end pages, the stitches that hold the pages together, all of these tell the story of the people who made the book. Their craft practices, their manual knowledge all come to life through our study of the book as object. Third, surprises. Bindings sometimes reveal unexpected things, reused parchment or other materials within the bindings, textiles used as part of the interior hidden away within the binding, metal objects such as pins, insects, and other organic material from past centuries. We used to discover these hidden surprises only when a binding had been accidentally broken or had deteriorated over time. Now, however, we can look inside virtually to see what has been concealed for centuries. You'll see some examples of this shortly. So let me introduce my colleagues who will show some amazing images and discuss the data challenges and the opportunities embedded in them. Each of them will speak for around 7 to 10 minutes, the first 2 offering some case studies and the third delving deeper into the digital space. At the end, I'll offer just a few words to tie together the various threads and to ask for your comments and suggestions and questions. We'll have plenty of time for discussion with questions, as Maria mentioned, posted in the chat, and we might be able to do some oral kind of follow-up as needed. So I'll introduce the speakers right now. Our first is Dr. James Sargan, who is the Leverhulme postdoctoral fellow in Alex Gillespie's Old Books, New Science Lab. His book is about the reading practices of pragmatic readers of English in the 13th century. It asks how we determine reading processes and engagement without the verbal evidence provided by marginal notes and written commentary. One key aspect of his work concerns the dimensionality of the book in space and time and its relation to the delivery of information. And this is what has brought James to address micro-CT evidence. Our second speaker will be Dr. Jessica Lockhart, head of research of the book and the Silk Roads, and a sessional instructor in the Department of English and Drama at the University of Toronto, Mississauga. She teaches courses on global literature, and her research explores the histories of riddles, marvels, and play, from late antiquity in North Africa to late medieval Britain. Jess is especially interested in the experience of wonder and how poetic expressions of wonder sometimes find it in the things that are the most ordinary. Our third speaker is Rachel de Cresce, Digital Project Librarian at the University of Toronto's Information Technology Services Department and the Project Librarian for the book and the Silk Roads. Before this, she was responsible for the Mellon-funded Digital Tools for Manuscript Study project. Rachel's own work interests include data management, UX, app design, open standards, 3D and digital project sustainability and scalability. So let me turn things over to Dr. James Sargan.
Thank you, Suzanne. And thank you for beautifully laying out the intellectual framework of the project, which gives me an opportunity to jump straight into my case studies. Given the focus of on digital scholarship here today, there are 2 parallel things that I want to achieve in the next 5 to 10 minutes. First, I want to give you a sense of the various types of data that we expected to collect when we started out on this project, and how we've made that data legible. And second, I want to show you a few of the cooler things that we found in our books along the way. So one of the things that the Books in the Silk Road's PIs knew that they wanted to do when they pitched this project to Mellon was to see what we could find by applying micro-CT imaging to the study of pre-modern bindings. And previously, micro-CT has been used to read manuscripts that have for some reason been rendered illegible. So there are some high-profile projects that you might have heard of. Brent Seale's team used it to unwrap some of the Herculaneum papyri, and it's also been used to uncover erased material and to read books and papyri that are too fragile to handle manually. Also, at the time that the grant application went in, the Art Gallery of Ontario in Toronto had just hosted an exhibition of boxwood miniatures, for which they had CT scanned a boxwood bead as a means of assessing its mechanical workings and reconstructing how it was made. So why not use it to uncover the structures within bindings, we thought. Even the bindings of books that are now, from the outside, apparently lost. So for those who don't know, here is a very basic book historian's view of the micro-CT process. Microcomputed X-ray tomography creates a three-dimensional representation of an object's interior by projecting a narrow beam of X-rays through the object onto a high-resolution detector behind. The three-dimensional or volumetric effect is created by rotating either the object or the X-ray source and the detector. So if you've had a CT scan at the hospital, you'll see the detector flies around above your head. That way, rather than a single flat image, the CT gathers and compiles many image slices, giving a researcher many possible ways of looking through the object. Now, what comes out when we image objects this way is a master file with a stack of sometimes thousands of images, each one of which represents a slice through the book. Each image is made up of volumetric pixels, which record information about all the possible views available in each slice. That means that with the right software, we can expand them out in order to move through 3 views of the book's internal structure simultaneously. And as you can imagine, the file sizes that come out of this are enormous. Just one of these folders can be over 3.5 gigabytes. And we usually end up with 2 or 3 per scan if we've decided to do a higher resolution close-up view. So then the problem becomes, what do we do with these files? They're too large to circulate efficiently among collaborators, and certainly too big to offer up to researchers online and expect them to be able to download them and use them at home. Moreover, they're too big for me to efficiently navigate on my typical personal laptop, where I have to load them from an external hard drive. So what I want to show you now are some of the ways we're working around that and some of the things we found while doing so. So first, let's look at a book scanned by our collaborators, Andrew Nelson, an archaeologist from Western University in London, Ontario, who worked on the box beads I mentioned earlier, and Debbie Williston, Western Special Collections librarian. And this is our proof of concept manuscript. So it's the first manuscript that we fully scanned. It's a French book of hours from the turn of the 16th century. The manuscript is currently in an 18th century binding, so we know that it's been rebound at least once since it was made. But we didn't know exactly what the sewing would look like. And here it is under micro-CT. So this video compiles every image in the CT file in a single plane at a rate of 20 frames per second to give an impression of moving downwards through the axial axis of the book, so in this direction. The small pale points you can see on the left-hand side moving in and out towards the sewing are cross sections of the threads. So I've highlighted them on the next slide. Here. And the regularity of the little dance they were doing in the video tells us something about the placement and pattern of the stitches that we can verify on other views. So in the frontal facing view, we see the path of the sewing here. And in the sagittal view, through the spine, we can see the supports that those threads are sewn onto. But that brings me on to a more exciting find. This book is haunted. And that's not a sentence I ever thought I would say, but in this book, we found the trace of a previous binding structure. So I've marked the current sewing for the manuscript's 18th century binding again in yellow, but we're interested in the series of holes that I've marked in red. Because the book isn't an object that exists in a totally linear plane, the spine is curved, the pages are not totally even. Often not all the features we want to see will appear in a single image, so those holes are quite hard to see on the screen at the moment. We wanted to get a view that combined different slices to show that the features that we were most interested in, and in some way replicate or stand in for the 3D viewing experience we have on a bigger computer. So using the processing software Dragonfly, we created a path through the center of each gathering, which is marked by this green line. The software flattens out the green line to show us a cross section of all the gatherings together, allowing us to see all of the sewing holes at the same time. And what we can see from that is the clear impression of a previous binding, a binding that was sewn on 4 supports instead of the current 3, with 3 sewing holes for each support, suggesting that these were split thongs requiring an extra stitch rather than the current single cords. Okay, so far we have video, we have some ways of manipulating images, we have annotation of various types. Now I want to move on to the book we managed to scan just before the university closed in March, which is a bit of a different structure. This is Thomas Fisher, Rare Books and Manuscripts Library, MS 01106, which is a Kashmiri copy of the Bhagavad Gita and other Hindu epics. We're interested in the manuscript for a lot of reasons. I could talk about it for a long time, but one of them is this wraparound binding with its rough fabric cover and deluxe underlayer, which you can just see poking through in the corner here. We wanted to know, are they contemporary to each other? And are they contiguous? Do they wrap around the entire book? So what I'm using here is what's called, here's another picture of the binding. What I'm using here is what's called a lookup table. We saw one before in the orange image a few slides back, but essentially it's a filter that changes the color of the scanned image according to the density associated with it. So if you were a geomechanic, as our collaborators in the engineering department at U of T are, you could establish one of these that just picked out the relative density of gold from whatever base rock, for instance, and highlight that on a scan very easily. In our scans, the materials are for the most part very close in density. So there's not much difference between parchment and wood. So I'm using some preset options that distinguish between very small modules of change. And this blue has been a good one for clarifying detail. And I'm going to move straight in on the question of fabric. So here we're looking at some of the high resolution images which are focused on the lower corner of the spine. And we're moving inwards through the layers of fabric around the inside of the cover. So we can count a first layer of loose weave cloth, a flap of fabric, and you can see the edge of the flap running just down the middle here, which is probably either the raw edge of the first layer of cloth folded in on itself or the turnover from the outside of the cover. and then inside that, a second layer of fabric weave. In time, it may be possible to measure and compare the weave of these three layers. But what we seem to be seeing here, and what we can see in other views, is a hint that the beautiful fabric I showed you at the start of the scan is present as a hidden underlayer throughout the binding. So with that in mind, Jess returned to the library with her microscope in tow and brought back these images, which show at between 50 and 100 times magnification, traces of colored threads seen through minuscule flaws in the fabric's outer covers. And so with those modes of parsing and breaking down our CT data laid out for you, I want to hand over to Jessica, who will show you some other more unexpected data rabbit holes we fell down.
Now that James has given you some examples of data that we expected to collect in our project, I'd like to add a couple of notes about how our research has responded to the unexpected. James has given you a couple of examples of sort of surprises we encountered, but now I'd like to talk a little bit more generally about research opportunities that came as a surprise. So Suzanne has already laid out the conceptual underpinnings of our project and alluded to our goal of forging connections and initiating collaborations between and among collaborators and research groups on an international scale. And the way that we have approached this in this phase one of our project has been to focus on 5 particular research clusters where we thought we could gather a group of people into a productive and interesting research relationship. So each research cluster has adopted a case study method and studied a book or a group of books that's been directly relevant to that focus. So, sorry. I am the head of research for the Old Books New Science Lab, which is coordinating these projects under the direction of the co-PIs, Alexandra Gillespie, Suzanne Akbari, and Sean Michael. And these have been the motivations behind the curtain, at least as far as I have seen them from my perspective of organizing these research projects. So we've been anxious to create this network of connecting isolated collections, scholars, conservators, and scientists into a mutually supportive collective community. And we've been doing this by working together in order to essentially establish friendships and connections of solidarity amongst these different groups. We've also been focusing on trying to contribute to the study and the conservation of neglected, threatened, or under-resourced books, especially those that have been displaced by colonialism, such as the Fisher Kashmiri manuscript that James alluded to, or that have been threatened by war or climate change, or are in precarious situations where they currently are held. In addition, we've been trying to develop new research methodologies for non-invasive study and find ways in which we amongst the research community can help to push new research methods forward, and also to identify new paradigms for understanding the history of book technologies in the pre-modern world. And Suzanne already described that extremely beautifully. So with these goals in mind, we've pursued case studies for each of our research clusters that can meet our research aims, but also that allow us to pursue these larger changes that we've been hoping to inculcate. And so I'm briefly going to mention 2 projects that we didn't expect to take on at all, at least not in their current form, but which have been inspiring to us, so that you can have context for the suffering that we've put Rachel de Cresce's team through on the data analysis side before I turn over to her. So one of these projects is our new application of collagen fingerprinting to the study of adhesives used to bind leather or cloth covers to the spines or boards of medieval manuscripts. In May 2019, this is to give you a sense of how we work, Alexandra Gillespie attended a biocode ecology workshop in Washington, D.C., hosted by the Beasts to Craft initiative. And at the meeting, it became clear that the adhesives used in medieval book bindings are too little studied. While this wasn't a project that neatly fell into any of our research clusters, it was very much in line with our goals of building collaborative relationships between scientists and conservators and across multiple institutions, so we decided to go for it. So we entered into the project with with two questions. First is it possible to determine the origin species of plant or animal proteins used in medieval glues? And second, what similarities and differences can be found between the glues used by bookmakers in the late Middle Ages across different geographical areas and making books for different needs and different cultural traditions? So for our experiment, we teamed up with Dr. Sarah Fidiment of the Beasts to Craft initiative led by Matthew Collins. Sarah Fidiment's research interests focus on the possibility of using ancient biomolecules retrieved from early books and documents as a biomolecular record, providing information about livestock economies, book production, craft technologies, and quality. Sarah is maybe best known for having developed the EZOOMS technique, or electrostatic zooarchaeology by mass spectrometry, which uses the rubbings of conservation eraser to pick up loose peptides from a heritage object's surface. Although EZOOMS has been used extensively for identification and analysis of medieval parchment, ours is the first study to test whether this technique could be used to identify the glues on medieval manuscripts. So Sarah provided our team with sampling kits, including sterile test tubes, PVC erasers, sterile papers for collecting these eraser rubbings, and gloves for use in the procedure. Meanwhile, our team reached out to conservators in Canada looking for suitable manuscripts that might contain medieval glue. Many manuscripts living in Canada have been rebound into modern bindings, obscuring any evidence that they might have had on medieval practices. Of the manuscripts still in pre-modern bindings, we were limited to the manuscripts that had already been damaged, allowing for adhesive study to be undertaken. In Canadian libraries, the number of suitable manuscripts was thus limited between 1 and 3 choices per repository. This limitation then necessitated the collaborative dimension of this project, bringing in multiple teams of conservators from Canadian institutions to take samples from their own collections. So the framework of methodology that Suzanne alluded to, of collaboration, was naturally spinning out of the limitations of our research. So one of our most interesting results so far has come from this manuscript, which is a treatise concerning Aristotle on the heavens and earth from, again, 15th century France. It's a small manuscript in the Thomas Fisher Rare Book Library, mostly paper with a few pages of parchment at the beginning and end. And it's bound in boards, half covered by leather, with raised bands along the spine. This binding is described in the catalog as beech boards, partially covered with pigskin with raised bands, with remains of clasps. This manuscript was suitable for us because one of the boards is detached completely from the book, allowing us to get interior access to the spine. I took some samples of the leather, the spine, and the parchment. And there I am. And here is where some things started to get a little more interesting once we sent these results to Sarah. So all 3 of our samples collected did reveal collagen particles, collagen peptides being present. And the results were, for this supposedly pigskin cover, pigs are different from other parchment animals in that they have a collagen marker at 1495 instead of 1427. Ours had a big collagen marker at 1427 and none at, essentially we were able to rule out that this was fake skin. It's just sheep. Everything is sheep. Almost everything is sheep. Then we tested the spine, and we found out that while the parchment that we had analyzed tested also as sheep, the spine tested with both sheep and cattle markers. So this was our first indication that we might be able to pick up adhesive with this method. So can you identify animal species for adhesives with EZOOMS? What we've discovered so far is that adhesives in pre-modern books do seem to yield collagen fingerprints that are detectable through this method. However, when adhesive species and parchment or leather species are the same, in other words, if they're all sheep, it's impossible to tell whether or which adhesive species is being used. Another limitation is that when a mix of species is detected, so far, again, it's impossible to tell whether the adhesive is a single species or a mix. So just because the adhesive samples show the presence of cow, it doesn't mean that the adhesive is purely cow. And in the creation of animal hide glue, using a mix of species from parchment tips or whatever would be easy. To give you a sense of the organic development of our project, I'll just mention one other adventure we had. At the Royal Ontario Museum, there is this leaf, which was part of 40,000 documents recovered from the Mogao Library cave near Dunhuang. and which were sealed in there around 1002 Common Era. This leaf is a devotional print from 947 Common Era Dunhuang, commissioned by Governor Cao Yanzhong for the Ghost Festival, which I think is August 4th if you care, if you want to mark it, celebrate it. As you can see, this leaf is heavily oil stained on its left edge. And there is a wonder here that I want to draw out before I continue, that when the Mogao cave was sealed, not only in this hoard of documents, not only was there this one poster, but there were 16 copies at least that have survived from this 50-year-old festival. And that's just of this particular print. There was a second print commissioned by the same governor with an additional 16. So there's an enormous volume of material has survived from this one festival in Dunhuang from over 1,000 years ago. So while we were experimenting with the limits of EZUMS and studying adhesives, we got the bright idea of seeing whether it could pick up any traces from animal butter oil. We arranged a visit to the museum using Sarah Fittiman's EZUMS kit that she had sent us. Paper conservator Janet Cohen took eraser rubbings from 4 areas on the leaf for analysis in proteomic study, in hopes that if the oil is animal-based, for example, if it comes from a butter lamp, there may be enough proteins mixed in with the lipids to allow us to determine species. But when I went to the ROM for the EZUMS analysis, Janet Cohen and Gwen Adams offered me the opportunity to study the leaf in unexpected ways. We looked at it under different lighting conditions and examined the accretions and nail holes under a microscope. These perspectives have made us wonder what happened to the copies between the period of their creation and their placement in the cave. How were they used in the community? Here's another little bit of gunk on the manuscript. So Amanda Goodman, my collaborator on this at the University of Toronto, has identified and tracked down digitized versions of these prints in their different repositories. Fortunately, there is a digitized version for almost all the prints we've discovered so far. What we found, oh yeah, here's a nice little inclusion of wood in the paper. What we found is considerable variation in the prints in multiple ways. So they have different current layouts, they have different methods of display, many have evidence of folding or rolling, and many were repaired. In some, there's a presence of color. In addition, I've gone through and looked for different patterns of wear. And again, we intended to study documents from Dunhuang, but this was a different physical direction than we ever anticipated. So here's just a couple of examples of some of the variety of these devotional prints from this festival and what happened to them. So this one was hung, this one was recycled, folded up, reinforced, is heavily painted. This one, they just liked the image block of Avalokiteshvara, and so they just cut out all the image blocks and made a nice sheet. So this new direction that we've taken has resulted in a comparative analysis of the physical evidence of these prints. So, so far they're providing connections between the contexts when prints found in different repositories seem to have similar use patterns that seem to come from that period between when they were made and when they were sealed in the cave. They also provide, in some sense, a timeline of the events that happened for that particular poster, where, as you can see here, the oil dripped on this page after this was added to help with the recycling of it. In addition, they provided a perspective on the variety of lives that these prayer sheets have had in the community. So the one on the left was doodled on, the one on the right was burned. And it's provided this sort of wonderful microcosmic image of print technologies and documents, not just as moments that mark the creation or use of particular technologies, but also little windows into the communities and lives that these objects have had in their period. So yeah, with this, I'm planning to turn it over to Rachel. Yeah, anyway, it's been just such a pleasure working on this project and working with experts in these different fields to discover their interests.
Hi, everyone. My name is Rachel de Cresce. I am from the Information Technology Services Department, as Suzanne mentioned, in the University of Toronto Libraries. I want to spend the next part of this talk talking about where we've gone with developing tools and workflows to support the type of work you've just heard about, as well as other things that have been going on with the project. I'm responsible for managing any of the development that we set out to do as part of our deliverables for the project. And I just want to go through kind of and give you a sense of kind of what was unique about this particular project from a development point of view, what challenges we faced, and where we hope to kind of keep going in the future with what we've been working on. So again, I'm just going to take a moment before I jump in to acknowledge the people who are responsible for doing a lot of this work. In particular, I want to bring attention to Shibo Liu and Imran Asghar, who are two project application developers, so the people that I work closest with and who actually are tasked with building the types of things we said we wanted to build. So very important to mention them, as well as our senior application developers in the department, Bilal Khalid and Andy Wagner. They aren't necessarily part of the project team, but what they are around to do is help us, give us advice if we have any problems, help us kind of, find our way if we're running into any issues. And as well as we have a network services team who is really responsible for supporting what we do and seamlessly integrating our development into the wider technical environment at the department. So I'm going to go through a little bit about the technical deliverables that we had for the project, and then sort of where we found ourselves situation-wise in the way in which the scholarly project was developing, and then kind of show you what we decided to do and what we'd like to do eventually. So we knew that we were going to have to do some sort of data management tool and workflow. As you saw, there's tons of different types of data, and there's a lot of data. And so we had to figure out how we wanted to manage that through its whole life cycle. So, and I'll go through that a little bit in more detail later. We wanted to be able to view a lot of this data side by side. So because it's so different, oftentimes it's kind of sequestered in its own little environment where you can kind of see it on its own. But if I have images, but I also have something else I want to look at, so any of those graphs or any of the other raw data that we produced for scientific analysis together, I can't really do that easily. So we wanted to try to do that in a way that was user-friendly, that kind of brought everything in together for a user, that kind of told a broader story about the object in general, and also a bookbinding visualization application. So exactly what it sounds like, a way in which we could kind of perhaps automate or help to create through a web application, bookbinding visualizations of different structures and how we might be able to go to do that in a way that was shareable, in a way that was could be used for a teaching tool or also sorts of different things. And sort of the underpinning here was that we wanted everything we did to be pluggable and interoperable. We didn't want to build on an island. We wanted to see if we could really just integrate this with a lot of things that were happening at the department, but also even more importantly, outside of the department, what other people might be doing with similar types of work. So as I'm not going to spend too much time on this because I think James and Jess has kind of really helped to describe like the sort of situation we were in. So a lot of the project characteristics here is like, in order to get to the deliverables, there were a lot of technical decisions that you must make about workflows, infrastructure, data models, all that kind of stuff. And this project is unique because we knew that there was a potential for unknowns. And we also knew that there was fluidity inherent with working in new spaces and learning about new things and working with new people. So from the outset, we didn't really know fully exactly what direction this project would take, all the types of data that would get produced, and nor all the different types of objects that would have become of interest to us. So what we did was that we knew that what we had to do was work with something that would produce, that would tell the story about the book from large amounts of heterogeneous data and about lots of objects. But the production of that kind of data is very collaborative and it's spread apart between scholars, institutions, and departments. So it was important to facilitate that sharing and collaboration with our data management plans. So the goal wasn't to understandably become experts in every field or every analysis technique. What we wanted to do is to create that sort of user experience that would make the data understandable and coherent in a single space for a regular user. So guiding principles. So given the situation, it became very obvious early on that this project was going to start moving in new and unexpected ways with the breadth of the material and the relevance. So this became problematic in the sense that if you're trying to create a data model that's going to describe the structure of all sorts of objects that are called books, that are from different regions, have different traditions, it becomes very difficult because we don't know everything. We don't know all the things that are out there, and nor are we all experts on every type of tradition. So it would actually be folly to think that you were going to create something that was going to encompass everything. So what we decided what was possible to do in this situation was to develop the data model and back-end infrastructure in a way that could move us forward towards our stated goals, but also allow enough room for change and evolution at all levels as the project moved ahead. And because of that, our first sort of approach was to take a flexible, iterative approach to development in a microservices environment. So I'm gonna, that's a lot of words I'll explain what they sound a little bit buzzwords, but what I mean for that is, we expected it to change and be fluid. So in order to do that, we had to match those needs in a way that we knew that if smaller bits of functionality needed to change, or even large bits of functionality, so major data model rewrites had to change, we wanted to be able to do that and course correct as we went. That required less time and resource strain than normally would happen if you were in that kind of a situation. Normally, we're used to developing where we already know what we're doing at the outset. We have a very defined data model we can build, and then I can easily kind of develop on top of that. This was not the case, so we had to do it a bit differently. So you may have heard of microservices before. If maybe it's boring to you, might be a little bit boring to you, but I just want to touch on this because it really does affect the way in which we've been working here. So normally you have a monolithic architecture normally in a department for a service, any kind of product really. That's kind of been the way in which a lot of libraries have worked. So if I use our department as an example, we use Islandora for our digital collection platform. And it comes pre-filled with Fedora, Islandora, and Drupal as the interface. And it's taking care of literally every aspect of that data experience from top to bottom within that stack. Microservices decides to take every bit of that and break it apart. And so you have sort of different parts of your architecture are doing very, very specific things, very one thing at a time. And that's what it's responsible for rather than rolling it into one. Both of these approaches have pros and cons, but for our given project, the benefit to us was that if we needed to alter something, we could swap out a specific piece and fix the connection rather than having to refactor the entire application from bottom up if we had to make a change. So that was kind of the way why we decided to do that. I'm not expecting you, this is like overwhelming. I'm gonna use this just to lead you through what we were doing, but please do not get scared off by this. I want to draw your attention in particular to a few things here. So I just wanted to show you this because it gives you kind of an idea. When I say microservices, I really mean microservices. We've kind of broken out. We have a couple UI elements that are sort of, this is what the user might interact with these sort of blue squares. But then we also have a place that's storing our binary data. There's a place that's storing our relation data. There's a place that's storing our IIIF manifest. There's something that's just responsible for processing our video uploads. It's completely sort of like broken apart into these little pieces, but it kind of gives you an idea of the breadth of like what's going on in the back end in order to facilitate a bit more of a easier user experience, but also an easier maintenance experience in one way, because obviously you still need to maintain all of these little things, but in one way, kind of it lets you be a little bit more flexible. And I want to point out one thing before I move on, before I forget. You'll see Neo4j here as our database. That's actually going to be changing. So all this is in flux at all times, but this in particular, I know for sure is changing. It's going to become dgraph, which is another graphing database, and I'll touch on that a little bit later. So data management. So as James mentioned, for one micro CT scan, you can have 3.5 gigs or more. And not only that, you can have multiple for one object. So you have a lot of different data here as well. I could have videos that get produced from that. We have raw data that's produced from that EasyOMS. We have process data, that's sort of the graphs or the images that James showed you that he had actually annotated and things like that. And you have concerns around how we're going to preserve all of this data, what we're going to do with it once we have it, how are we going to share it, how are we going to move it through our infrastructure. And what we really were focused on is sort of fair data principles. You may have heard this before, making sure that the data is findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. So there's concerns around metadata, giving contextual information for all this data as well, and sort of how we want to make sure that we use that in a way that is sustainable and forward thinking at the same time. So continued, as what I was pointing out before, these are our sort of 3 pillars of data management right now. That's in the infrastructure that I showed you the diagram. So The dgraph and min.io is sort of holding all that binary data. And by that, I mean those images, the videos, process scientific data, metadata, binding descriptions, that kind of thing that are kind of living there. So we knew we could manage the process data. This is stuff that we want our users to see. This is the stuff that the scholars have decided this is important. Out of that huge stack of stuff, I have something particular I want to focus on and I want to share with everyone. So here's what I'm going to use. Dataverse, which is actually managed outside of our department, but still lives within the University of Toronto at Scholars Portal. If you're familiar, Dataverse is a repository for data sets. You may be able to guess it. And it allows you to deposit large amounts of data, create all sorts of metadata about that object. It mints a DOI for the object, so you can always reference it forever. You know, the data set's there. And what this allows us to do is, although we are, creating this piece that is showing you all the process data and sort of helping the user navigate through that, we also have these huge sets of raw data, and that's just as important. And if we want to make sure we maintain that data, we have to put it somewhere and make it available. Somebody who does understand how to use those data sets, might be familiar with that software, could go to this to Dataverse and download that data set and do their own type of analysis on it themselves. So we're they don't have to rescan it. We're making sure everything's available. What we've done, we want it open to everyone else. And in addition, the good thing about Dataverse is it has very robust metadata protocols. And you can also apply like metadata frameworks and control vocabularies from different fields. So as you imagine, like we're creating new data that doesn't normally get created in the humanities. So perhaps the metadata fields I would use to describe it are not sufficient. I need to look to the way in which engineers or medical professionals would use to actually describe that data set. And I want to apply it here. I want to make sure that I'm maintaining sort of that level of description across different fields. And then we also have a data asset management system at the library. So this is sort of all of our data that we want to preserve, we throw in here. So this is sort of what we are planning to do, sort of a pipeline from the admin in there, as well as hopefully and pulling it from Dataverse into our system as well. So we have the whole data sets in there together. And I've just highlighted them for you. So Dataverse, again, off to the side, but sort of those three parts within our infrastructure that we have, and fourth being Dataverse to sort of manage what's going on here. So the other sort of guiding principle is open interoperable standards and open source. So open interoperable standards. So I'm going to go through what that means. So open source in particular refers to our softwares. So we use open source softwares at the library. We like to do that. So sort of all the pieces that you see floating around in that diagram are things that we have used that are open source. We've kind of cobbled them together to make that back end. Also, anything we build that we think could be reusable for other people, we are putting on our GitHub repository for the institution. So again, so we're sort of allowing people to use that at will, as they will, make changes, do whatever they want with it on their own as well. And then open access. So this is sort of where it makes sense to be as open access as possible with the data. There are definitely going to be situations where you may not want to be so open with some of the data. Depends. There's always the potential is always there. These are very old objects, but at the same time, because we're doing work that sort of goes cross-cultural and cross traditions, you have to understand that our sort of default to everything should be open access doesn't always apply, and we have to be aware of that and know that we have to change that as we need. So sort of being open access to a point to where it makes sense is sort of where we wanted to go as well. So I just highlighted a couple things here that are responsible for some of our open access and interoperable parts. So we use IIIF in particular, and these are the two pieces that do it in our infrastructure. We have a resolver that does one thing, and we have a server that serves out the information as we call it. And I'll tell you right now, if you're not familiar with IIIF, so that's a short form for the International Image Interoperability Framework. It is a set of APIs to promote the sort of sharing of image-based resources around the world. So in a unified way. So it can handle images, it can handle videos now as well. And it can also integrate with web annotation. So it can handle annotation data at the same time. So web annotation is a W3C recommendation that we make use of as well. So we're not only using the software, we're also looking outward to see what's everyone else doing with their image data, with their video data, with other types of data, and that so that we can actually make sure we can share. So anything that gets put in our infrastructure can easily be taken out of our infrastructure and put somewhere else or shared somewhere else. So we're not kind of, you know, putting it in something that it kind of gets locked into forever. And finally, along with those standards is the way in which we're describing and building data models around these things. We are looking elsewhere as well, because again, this is new for a lot of people, and it's us especially, we're sort of to build a description model for a binding. It's not something that's necessarily in my field of study, so looking elsewhere. So the language of bindings was thesaurus, which gives you descriptive terminology for bindings, has been very helpful for us for talking about the way in which we want to name certain aspects of bindings, sort of having that shared vocabulary, especially with particular types of objects. This does focus a lot on Western bindings, but our goal here is not to just stay faithful to this, but to also expand upon it. So as we learn more, as we understand how to describe different types of objects, different types of bindings, we can actually add into it as we go, and it's sort of not view it as sort of the be all and end all of the way in which we're going to describe all of these bindings. And also the Legatus data model. So this helps us particularly with our binding visualization application that I referred to at the beginning, and I'll continue to talk about later. But this is sort of a way in which to systematically describe a binding structure in a way that is very detailed, where you can see small differences from one to from another, and kind of really get down into all those little aspects of it. So someone has already done this work, a very good work of this. So, and is also very well thought out and open to change. So again, why, you know, try to do it again? Why not take it and expand upon it, add to it, work with these people to see kind of like how we can make it better, rather than kind of doing it again. So again, looking outside, trying to make sure we're staying with what's popular now, or at least what's sort of standardized, or things that we want to become standardized a little bit. And that helps us give us a little bit more direction, a little bit quicker, and also makes us a little bit more flexible, because we have other places we can look when we have to make a decision, or just give us a little signposts along the way of how we want to handle stuff. So these three in the circle are the actual deliverables. So those things that people are going to interact with are also the things that we would point to say, this is what we built, here, go take a look at it. So these are the things that you could go to on a URL at some point, not yet, and play around with the data and use it and that kind of stuff. So we have an admin UI, a viewer, and that viz binding name to be determined, but something along those lines. Again, with as I said before, we are keeping this theme where everything we built, it's built upon open source software. So all the things you see listed here that are powering all these different tools are using open source software. And we're going to keep doing that. And, you know, there are obviously some cons to that sometimes, but for the most part, we really like to be able to contribute back to those communities as well as we're learning, and we like to be able to, you know, also stay abreast of what's going on in the technology world outside of our department, so we kind of know where things are kind of moving generally, and we can make sure we're not, you know, we're building for that and not, you know, 5 years ago kind of thing. So, and I'm going to stop talking so much. I'm going to give you some demos of things that we have built, and hopefully you can get an idea of what we're talking about. So some of these videos we're not processing, so I'll have to get out and show them elsewhere, but I'm going to start here. So this is our admin interface. This is where a user would come in to create a book, an object, and also upload data related to that object, no matter what the type of data is. But most of it's going to be processed data, so things that they've recognized as important to that book in particular, as well as bibliographical information, binding descriptions they might want to include about that object in particular, and a few other things that you're able to do in here. So the way in this just works, we think of the book as sort of a collection almost. So it's sort of there's an object that's a book, and no matter what that is, we've defined as a book, and it will contain a bunch of information about it. So you'll notice throughout here, I have to own up to something. I misspelled the name of this manuscript multiple times. I apologize. It's Grendel, not Grendel. So you're going to see it over and over again. And I apologize for that. I can tell that I work with the tech and I don't actually look at the manuscripts very often. So I'm just creating this this book here, and you can put in a title and a short description, a little thumbnail that sort of represents the object itself. And then you see you have it and you can open it up. So, so I'm going to, sorry, went too far. So once you have the book, something else that you can do now is you might, oops, sorry. I'm still in the same thing here. Oh, I'm going to do the image upload. So
Rachel, Rachel, I just wanted to ask, so you have about 3 minutes left. Is that about right?
I have a little bit more than that. If you want me to be quicker with it, I can totally
we want to make sure we have enough time for questions in the discussion. So maybe a little bit compressed, just a bit.
Sure, not a problem. Then I will just be.
You're seeing quickly. Our nimbleness and our fluid approach on the fly.
in live time. So I'll just show you very quickly just a couple more kind of aspects of this where do this, where we kind of, again, I'll talk over this and tell you exactly what's happening. So, you can create bibliographical information that you can also export and use elsewhere or import. You can create these sort of image sequences. So if you have a sequence of images that's for micro CT images, but you also have a set of images that are for those microscopic images that you have, or you have another set for that's something else, and you have a video, you have something else, it becomes sort of a separate piece of the puzzle that gets added to this one book, and you can do it all through this interface. So it's simply, I mean, I'm sure you've used upload features before, so I'm gonna move through this fairly quickly, but you attach all of your images, and what ends up happening is it gets thrown into our database, the relationships get stored, and we can create IIIF objects, which means that we can have interoperable images. So we can then have something that we can share outward with other people. They can come and they can take them and they can do what they want with them. And sort of, I think the only other thing that I think I would like to show you when it comes to this in particular is sort of how we've decided to deal with the viewer aspect of this. So I would like to do this. I had to do this separately because it wouldn't process, but you can, let's say we put these images in, I'm opening this up in a viewer tab now, and you can kind of go through them all, kind of see them. But what you can also do, which is very interesting, is open up all sorts of other data in here. So perhaps you have interest in another object. So this object here is actually in the Internet Archive, but it's the actual digitized manuscript of that micro CT one. So you can kind of take that URL itself, plop it into the viewer, and it'll open up with it as well. So now you have your data sitting next to the data that's hosted at the Internet Archive. You could put in the video as well, that micro CT scan that's sort of showing you the coming in and out of the book. And so you have this experience where you have both of them at the same time. In here as well, you could do things like annotate and all that kind of stuff. So that is sort of where we are right now, and I'd like to just wrap it up and as we run out of time here. So sort of what I'd like to leave you with is how the purpose of this, especially with the binding structures, with the admin interface, truly the things that we're working towards with all of this is building all of these tools in a way that allows them to be interoperable, that allows to be pluggable, that we can swap out pieces as we need, and really respond to the scholar's need as the project develops. So we're not kind of subscribing them and forcing them into a box necessarily. We're actually trying to build around and figure out the best way in which to do this so that we're sort of addressing the user needs, we're addressing the data needs, and we're sort of working towards a way in which we can facilitate this sort of creation and collaboration and then sharing at the same time. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, James, Jessica, and Rachel. Those were fantastic, and I love these presentations. They're wonderful. I'd like to remind people who have been listening to feel free to put questions in the chat. And in the meantime, I'm just going to gather together a few of the threads of some of the things that have been said in the last little while. One of the things I was really struck by was James' discussion of the size of files, just like how are we going to deal with all this data, all this information, and the implications of that. And this is something that emerged in Rachel's comments to some extent as well, and we might want to continue thinking about different user needs. What kinds of image needs are in place when we're talking about public outreach, even things like circulation of things on social media as a way of sharing the kind of work we do in the university research setting. What kinds of ways we want to share data through web resources to the interested public, to researchers who are not within our own community, but who are well equipped to make use of the data, including very large file sizes, and also researchers within our own research networks, making it easy and accessible. So this was something I thought was worth thinking about more. I was really struck also in Jess's presentation when she was talking about the collaborative framework and the way in which that interacts with the limitations that are placed on our research sometimes. For example, when she was talking about with the EasyOMS technologies, how once we kind of narrowed down what the options were, we were looking at not more than 1 to 3 volumes per repository that were eligible for EasyOMS analysis, proteomic analysis. And what she didn't mention, of course, was the pandemic. Right, though she did say, a scan we did right before everything shut down. We were actually, not that it hasn't been a hard year, and not that there hasn't been a huge amount of suffering that we're mindful of, but we were well positioned to be nimble, to react, because we've been working so hard to establish networks of collaborators. We had to change many of the things that we had planned to do, but we were also able to sort of devolve certain kinds of tasks for people to do in local ways. So more than ever, even though our project was global, it was also intensely local, and that local quality was intensified through the pandemic. I was also really struck by this lovely thing that Jess said when she was talking about the printed image from the Royal Ontario Museum. The objects, the burn marks or stains from an oil lamp tell us about the lives that these objects have had. That is not just the conditions of their making, but their ongoing lives. And that sense of movement through time, I really, I felt that. Rachel talked beautifully about fluidity, and that I think is perhaps one of the most important takeaways here. She said, we didn't know what direction the project would take us, and there had to be room for change, to which I will say amen. That was going to be always true with this project, and this year has made that true more than ever. And I was also really interested hearing her talk about the different ways of understanding data management and the different kinds of repositories, dgraph, Dataverse, and DAMS. The different kinds of ways of storing data, taking into consideration all the different implications, not just file size, but how open is too open, how open is the right level of open, and really moderating that appropriately. And also, I don't know how many of you noticed this moment when she was talking about Dataverse, and she was talking about the need to have good metadata, searchable metadata, structured in appropriate ways. And she talked about being attentive to keeping an eye on what other people are doing. And she mentioned medical professions, the ways in which they use data and metadata, thinking especially about like ultrasounds and other kinds of imaging. That's bizarrely enough, that's one of our counterparts, medical imaging, and what we've been doing in this project in terms of the size of the data sets, in terms of the ways in which we think about metadata, the kinds of structuring issues and also searchability issues. It's a lot of common ground. And I flag that because not to say the humanities should be more like the sciences, but to say the humanities have a lot to tell the sciences. We need to be talking to one another as much as we possibly can, and as much as is appropriate. And those were the threads I wanted to gather together. I know there's a few questions in the chat already, and I'm just gonna read some of those and direct those to James and Jess and Rachel as appropriate. The first question from Amélie Couvrat says, thanks for the talks. I'd like to know if the results on the Kashmiri Bhagavad Gita will be published, or how can we get the outcome of the research? There's a group of us that work on that together with one of our collaborators, Luther Obrock, who's a specialist on Sanskrit texts with a particular interest in Kashmiri manuscripts. So stay tuned, and we will make sure to circulate information on that. It is hopefully coming very soon. And some comments on Grendel, which I will skip over. And here, a question from Veronica Biocati. Thank you for the talks. I have a question for Rachel, who was speaking regarding a way for describing in detail different bindings. Since I'm focusing on specific features and marks on the page, stains, holes, marginalia, ruling, and so on, I'm looking into developing a grid which would be able to be overlaid on top of an image in the manuscript in order to easily locate features on the page. This would have 2 axes with identifying labels in order to quickly and specifically identify a position. I've yet to come across any existing grid that has been used in manuscript or art analysis before, or any software that already exists, which would be useful in developing that. Would you have any suggestions? Rachel, do you want to address that?
Sure. I have to say, I don't know exactly something that would do this. However, I think this could be done using, if you take a look at some transcription tools, that kind of the point of which is to sort of parse out the same section every time around. It would be an extension on that, or sort of an overlay on top of it that would tell you sort of the quadrant and things that you have. In particular, I could think of a couple ways in which to accomplish such a thing, but it would require a little bit of work with certain existing APIs for images that exist, such as the IIIF image API, where you can actually get down to the pixel as you want to. So it could be a similar thing where if you overlaid it, it could actually give you the pixel location on top of that image every time, so you know exactly where you're looking to and actually map it onto another one. So the technology is very possible, and I can see it happening here. I haven't really seen anybody doing this yet, but I will make a note of it, because there's sort of constantly projects going on in that space that do all sorts of things that tend to, with manuscripts, that I've never seen before. So I can keep an eye out and see, and also very welcome to give me an email, and I will pass on any information that I find, or if I can find someone who might actually be interested in helping with such a thing.
Be careful, Rachel. Everybody will want you. I can't have that. Another question that I think will go to Rachel from Angie Bennett. Who is that administrative interface for?
Okay, well, first, it's a very exclusive club. It's going to be all the scholars that are on this project particularly. So what they find and what they want to upload. But the URL will be active, and that the public can come see this stuff. And there will be account management. So I'm hesitating only slightly, because the sort of management of a sort of a wide scale app that's anyone can use anywhere, make an account and use, is a little bit like I'm not the one to make that decision. But we could see where we have collaborators who would need an account and could go in themselves and add in their data and their descriptions and their metadata that they want to put in there, and have it become part of that whole ecosystem.
Thanks. So I'm going to turn to a question from Sebastian Bosch, who, again, thanks for the talks, likes the work. 2 questions. First one, is there any manual SOP available for the correct sampling with the rubber, which may also convince owners of objects that this is non-invasive? Jess, I wonder if you want to address that, because I know you were giving a lot of thoughts to this whole question of, conversations with conservators who appropriately are very protective of the materials that they're responsible for, and owners too of privately held objects.
Yes, absolutely. So in our approach to testing whether EZUMS could be used for adhesives, we built off the work that had already been done by Sarah Fidement and the Beasts to Craft Collective, and in their work on manuscript parchment. So in effect, they had already published and made the case that this process was non-destructive. And Sarah also sent us their manual, essentially, for how to conduct it safely. However, we did have to make some modifications in terms of logistical, like the logistics of getting, gently rubbing the inside of an exposed piece of spine. It's very different from rubbing a manuscript page. And our collaborator, Lauren Williams at McGill University, was absolutely fabulous at helping to, we drew on her expertise as a conservator, and who had a sort of greater logistical understanding of the problems than I did. Also, Debbie Merritt-Williston is just they're wizards at taking samples. But in terms of assuming standardization, where possible, I was present for the sampling in order to provide some continuity and some recording of what we did, and just sort of provide a through line for the process as much as possible.
Jess, there was a second question from Sebastian Bosch about what he refers to as statistical amount of samples, but I think you've talked already about the sort of continuity across sampling. And what about contamination? This is something that came up already a little bit when you were talking about the glue issues. Do you have more to say about contamination?
Yeah, I mean, this is a question that I think would be better. I think it'd be better to put you in touch with Sarah Fidement. The way that we have been approaching this is the beauty of EasyOMS is that it allows people with very little, biocodological expertise to be able to take the samples. So the people who are expert at dealing with the physical objects undertake that part of the process, and then we mail it to the lab who are able to process it more effectively. I know that Sarah has been alert to the possibilities of contamination, and I know that she has a good answer to this question, but I don't know it.
And if I could just add as a little addendum to that, one of the interesting things we discovered was you were mentioning that the importance of this EasyOMS methodology is that it doesn't require a lot of training or a lot of specialized skills. Think about how important that is when we're dealing with manuscripts and with the people who are looking after the manuscripts in underserved parts of the world, where conditions are maybe not great, where the low overhead with regard to this analysis method is really valuable. So we were talking, for example, about trying to work with people on the ground in local repositories in Ethiopia, for example, where there's there's a lot to say about this, but there'd be a tremendous value in mapping out a little bit better the nature and the sources of the parchment, the goatskin parchment that's used there. There's very little work been done on goatskin. Comparatively speaking, as Jess said, everything is sheep. So the possibilities that open up there are profound.
If I could add a little bit to what you said, Suzanne, about local forms of analysis, another area in which that really emerged for our project was with microCT, where initially we envisioned sort of a very difficult process of sending manuscripts to institutions to be scanned. But then we sort of had this abrupt paradigm shift, partly because of the pandemic, but also just insurance difficulties, where we realized that most universities have several microCT scanners that are capable of
Right there.
that are, yeah, exactly. You just have to make friends with a geomechanical engineer or a pharmacist. And they in turn have amazing perspectives on what you can learn about physical objects in different states of deterioration. So that was one of the main takeaways for us that we didn't really address is the value of making connections that are across discipline, but also quite local.
Thank you, Jess. I'm going to turn to questions from Rita Sawaya. And I think maybe the first two of the three would be good for James. And then the last one of copyright, I might direct to Rachel, who doesn't work on copyright, but I know the library is deeply interested in that. So Rita Sawaya says, thanks for the presentations. First question, do we have ways of studying colors and ink in non-invasive procedures within this project? And the second question, what's the highest quality of image downloadable for researchers? This kind of speaks to that question of what size of image for whom. Do you want to address that a bit, James?
Sure. Do we have ways of studying colors and ink in non-invasive procedures? Yes. Do we have them within the program right now? No. We have to admit to being really quite hardcore codicologists in some ways and not being super interested in texts always. So it's not something that has come up to the front of our research interests yet. But one of the things we did find with our CT scanning was, as I said in the beginning of my talk, it's been used before to unroll and read texts that can't be read. And mainly that works because most Northern European texts from kind of the start of the Middle Ages all the way through to about the 1800s used iron gall ink, which has traces of metal in, and so the X-rays show up metal really easily and the black ink shows up. The difference with the Kashmiri book we were studying is that the black ink is a carbon ink, so it doesn't show up at all. All we can see is the red ink. So that's a problem that perpetuates, like this technique can't be used for any written materials in carbon ink, and it's a problem that we've just started thinking about, and we're hoping we'll be able to use CT scanning and find a method that does show up the carbon inks. So it's a new direction for us, but it is a direction we've just started thinking about.
And if I can just add on a little bit to that, James, You were mentioning that the study of colors and ink hasn't been at the forefront of the project, but at least one of our collaborators, Elodie Dupuy Garcia, who's down at the University of Mexico, is deep in that space with regard to Nahua Mesoamerican manuscripts. And I mention that because, again, one of the qualities of this project is that as we work with and bring in researchers who are collaborators who are working in particular areas, different areas around the world, they often will have interests that converge closely with our project and also other kinds of interests. So this has been a part of the fluidity, to borrow Rachel's term, that's characterized this project. And it's not a coincidence that there's what you might call almost a kind of a little sister project, a project that's not on quite, it's not in the same technological space, but also has a comparable approach to the global past, called Practices of Commentary, also based up at the University of Toronto. We have a number of people who are sort of involved in each of these projects, both of these two projects. This one focused on material culture, that one focused on commentary as a practice and the communities who do that, and therefore the text and the visual layout. So when we think about this sort of the human landscape that makes up this sort of complicated network, we are often pulled in slightly different kinds of directions. I don't want to forget, Rachel, would you like to say a little bit about copyright or like images, either with regard to image quality or size, and then this copyright issue?
Sure. So the image quality, I can't off the top of my head, James, if you know, but of the sort of TIFFs or the JPEGs that get generated from the micro CT scan, I'm not sure how big those are. But for now, those are what would be downloadable. If you wanted to download it, but I will give a little plug again to IIIF. Technically, you don't have to download it, because by using IIIF, you could just reuse the image over and over again, because it has a persistent URI, it never leaves, and you could just constantly refer to that, but you'd be able to do that. And also for rights. So I didn't get to it in when I was speaking, but there is a sort of robust bibliographical section of that admin interface where there's a spot to put every contributor that's touched this project. So if somebody was micro CT scanning, they get the credit. If somebody was doing the EZOMS for us, they're going to get credit. And there's going to be a link to the raw data somewhere as well. And where that raw data is, there will be credit again to those people in particular. So we're kind of maintaining sort of, we want to make sure that everybody is credited for that. But we're also saying that like, this is data for everyone. So in the situations where that wouldn't be appropriate, then we would have to control the way in which that particular data would be shown. And that would be something technologically probably very simple, where if you were logged in, you might be able to see some data. And if you were not logged in and just viewing, you cannot see certain data. That kind of stuff, we would try to maintain a way in which to do that. But that's how we would handle that.
Thanks, Rachel. Jess put into the chat some resources, especially Ira Rabin's work, Rabin's work on ink, the study of ink, and also Veronica has added some commentary on that as well. What I want to do is, before turning things over to Maria for some final closing words, James, Rachel, and Jess, did you have any things you wanted to add as we finish?
Just thanks for giving us an opportunity to talk through some of our experiences and discoveries in this project. It's really wonderful to have this audience and to get to have this conversation amidst this pandemic.
Yeah, no, I agree. This has been really fruitful for all of us, and I want to thank everybody for coming. Maria?
Yes, I also want to thank all of you for quite an interesting presentation. Eye-opening, certainly, as I can imagine how you feel when you start with something this big and all of a sudden it keeps growing and growing and growing and growing. I have to commend you, because one of the things that I admire most about these projects, and sometimes it gets overlooked, it's the collaborations and the connections that they create. We cannot do this alone. And like Rachel was mentioning, I mean, all of you were mentioning, you touch the medical, you touch the engineering, you touch, and we all have to be open to allow those collaborations. I think that's hand in hand with the share and the collaborations, and it all equals digital scholarship and open access and everything else. So I want to thank you all, the four of you, Suzanne, Rachel, Jessica, and James, for an awesome presentation. I hope we can further down the road present more an update version of how your project is going. I would love to see the progress that you've made in all areas. And I would like to also thank all of you who have joined us today. And I invite you to keep tuning with the Digital Scholarship at the Institute as we bring more of these workshops to the public. Again, thank you very much. And a warm goodbye from the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey. Thank you.